I have to be honest. As a descendant of Afro-descended people, the kingdom of Dahomey never really sat well with me. Upon first glance, Dahomey just looked like a horror film to me, with depictions of their kings atop thrones with skulls below them, and the countless beheadings of Africans, men and women, seemingly for no other reason but projection of power. But as I forced myself to give it another look, I gotta say, Dahomey has to be one of the most unique African kingdoms in West Africa, and I can't help but remain fascinated by them. What up, African world? It's Home Team here, and I'm back at it with another video of African history, culture, and worldview. And as always, if you want to support the Home Team, you can do so on patreon.com. I have some new rewards for you guys, so be sure to check that out. Also, go to Afrographics.com, a website where you can find unique illustrative infographics summarizing African history. All links to Patreon, Afrographics, and Home Team merchandise are in the description box below. To begin, Dahomey to some degree hasn't exactly gotten the fairest shake. Aside from the typical European degradation of Africans, Dahomey does deserve some criticism, especially from the African diaspora, for their aggressive participation in the Atlantic slave trade. Here's the thing with Dahomey. I wouldn't say they were drastically different from any other African group around. In fact, they literally did the same exact thing other Africans were doing in other regions. But what makes Dahomey unique is that they simply took it to the next level. Their participation in the slave trade and interaction with being enslaved themselves nearly in totality defined the direction of their civilization. Now, I know some in the diaspora would be vehemently opposed to me saying that, but I think we have to be honest. Dahomey was a nation formed from the oppression of the Yoruba peoples, and because of this oppression and enslavement, they said never again. Thus, they became some of the most fierce people in the region. Let's start from the beginning. Dahomey was a state in West Africa in the region of modern-day Benin that was founded by the ruling dynasty of the Fan or Aja peoples during the 17th century. The kingdom of Dahomey began as a tributary state to the Yoruba kingdom of Oyo, and they certainly did not appreciate how they were being treated by the Yoruba. Dahomey eventually broke away from Oyo and for the most part vowed to take revenge on the Yoruba, especially those located in modern-day Benin. Dahomey came to be the most efficient African state in the region, and they set out to conquer the stateless and leaderless people who lived in the nearby plateau. Dahomey became a highly centralized state with a very well-organized and disciplined military machine. All this greatness was created to never be under the yoke of Oyo again. In other words, Dahomey was founded with a clear purpose: to become so powerful that they would never be enslaved again. And they committed a number of, let's just say, ambitious things to ensure this was the case. By the late 17th century, Dahomey was in command of the coastal hinterland, which it raided at will to collect slaves. While the power of Europeans was becoming greater along the coast, other Aja kingdoms were going in decline as they refused to trade with them. Dahomey, power-hungry as they were, saw this as an opportunity to become the primary power in the region. Also, their eagerness to trade with Europeans was kind of like sending a nasty letter to Oyo, if you catch my drift. To make things simple, the Dahomeyans were low-key the Zulus of West Africa, as their rulers usually only rose to power via courage in battle and success in war. In other words, you had to show and prove yourself before you can rule Dahomey. Now, this is not at all to say that other nations in Africa did not do this, but I'm simply saying that this was the very fabric of Dahomeyan statehood and advancement. In a traditional sense, African kings who conquered other regions for the most part allowed self-governance, but not Dahomey. Neither vassal kings nor separate laws were recognized. The king and his council of advisors dominated hereditary aristocrats. The primary thing that draws our attention to Dahomey, and the thing that has given them world fame, was the power of women in that kingdom. The power that women exhibited in Dahomey was unique in all of West Africa. Female officials across Dahomey, known as Inyei, served in each province as the king's special envoys. They inspected male officials' work and reported any irregularities directly to the king. In other words, if you were a king and your region was conquered by Dahomey, you more than likely had to answer to a woman concerning your dealings from time to time. This is incredibly unique to West African history because it speaks to the very origin of the Dahomeyan state. Dahomey was a state fashioned in crisis and warfare, and so every able-bodied soul was recruited to participate in the affairs of the state, no matter the gender. This is what draws our fascination to Dahomey in the Western world, because this was so rare. If it wasn't for Dahomey, Black Panther in its most exhilarating form would not exist, because it was the state of Dahomey that developed a special class of fierce female warriors called the Mino, literally meaning our mothers. To be honest, despite my weird relationship with Dahomey, I can't resist my fascination with the Mino. Not only were these women recruited for warfare, but some of them even joined the army simply to protect their children from the Yoruba slave trading cavalry of Oyo. This only further proves my point that Dahomey was the extreme resistance and response to oppression in that region. In a world where women are usually subservient or deferential to men, this marked an extraordinary development in human history. The British explorer Sir Richard Burton called these women warriors Amazons, which created the legend we know so well today, and the theme in Black Panther that we simply can't resist. The civil service of Dahomey planned and managed the economy for the king. Farm production allowed for the support of all royalty, the elite, the urban craft population, the army, and a surplus cash crop for sale. During crop shortages, the government forced specific regions to produce more of it. The state collected income tax, custom duties, and road tolls to generate operating revenue, and this revenue, together with guns and ammunition, became the foundation for Dahomeyan power, and more importantly, their freedom. Because without establishing this, the Dahomeyans would simply become victims of a neighboring kingdom's slave raids. Before their independence, Oyo frequently raided Dahomey and forced the Dahomeyans to pay the Yoruba tribute in the form of an increased but tragic flow of slaves. But this is where my relationship with Dahomey becomes very estranged. Now, most African kings participated heavily in the slave trade, but it would seem as though Dahomey mastered it. In one vein, I sympathize with the collective plight of the Dahomeyan state because of three things. Number one, the Dahomeyans had to constantly give the state of Oyo slaves as tribute under their dominance. Number two, in order to gain weapons to compete with other kingdoms around them, they also had to supply the Europeans with slaves. And number three, in order to gain access to horses, they had to give the Hausa in northern Nigeria slaves. So literally, in nearly all areas of their national advancement, in order to exist and remain relevant, they had to be aggressive in the slave trade. Even though that's tough, the Dahomeyans embraced it to its fullest. Their ultimate goal was power and territorial expansion. Now, despite this horror, we still had to put it in its proper perspective. We often don't like to hear it, but for those Africans, the overwhelming majority of them thought of slavery completely different from how we do today. Slavery, for the most part, for them, was equivalent to what we know as European serfdom in their minds. Tradition demanded the adoption of loyal slaves into master's family, and it certainly was not uncommon to reward a former slave of land and freedom following the master's death. Descendants of slaves would even assimilate into society as members of one social class or another. Now, that's certainly not to say that there weren't many slaves who were mistreated, but I'm trying to put it all in a context that simply cannot be ignored if we are to advance proper historical perspectives. Because oftentimes, Dahomeyans are portrayed as bloodthirsty savages, especially because of their mass killings. And this is something I struggle to understand. Something that turned me off to Dahomey completely. I can understand the occasional brutality of a state that takes over a region, but for the life of me, I could not understand Dahomey and their harsh treatment of other human beings for no apparent reason. But upon closer examination, The mass killings of the Dahomey state surprisingly has an explanation. Slavery was pivotal to their survival, as mentioned before, whether we like it or not. It advanced their economy and it protected their very existence. The mass killings has everything to do with the survival of their state when you put it in context. Here's how the horrific mass killings started in Dahomey. Dahomey gathered together large numbers of slaves at special coastal Balkan stations. Here, they waited for European slave ships that visited every month or so. European slave traders preferred to buy entire shiploads of slaves rather than buy slaves in lots from different ports. Europeans tried to give Dahomey kings sufficient time to collect an entire shipload of slaves before actually coming to the port. Oftentimes, Europeans miscalculated how long it would take Dahomeys to gather a shipload of slaves. If European slave traders waited too long, then slaves at coastal Balkan stations exhausted local food supplies. And thus, Dahomey kings devised massive ritual murders rather than watch slaves die of starvation. The kings unfortunately viewed these killings as humanitarian, and to justify these acts to their people, they claimed that such rituals were required to guarantee their continued strength, vitality, and courage to rule. In time, this became part of their tradition. On several occasions, European slave traders pulled into port to buy slaves from the Dahomeys, but soon witnessed to their horror the bloody ritual murders, not realizing that their demand for slaves helped to cause this. Now, if we can bear to squint our eyes and hold our hearts to look past the atrocities of Dahomey, we would see it for what it is: one big, massive African irony. Because for Dahomey, the need for defense against nearby slave-raiding states and the need to collaborate with Europeans and other Africans to guarantee the safety of their children caused them to perpetuate the very thing they were trying to avoid. Its armies pushed out in all directions, trying to create buffer zones to safeguard their existence. I have no interest in providing any excuse for Dahomey's willing participation in this horrifying history, but as I take a step back, I can't help but understand that the history of Dahomey is a history of an extreme reaction to a chaotic environment. Whereas I had no sympathy for the formation of their state, I find myself willing to give an ear to their plight. But that's just me. Well, I'm all out, guys. Please let me know what your thoughts are concerning Dahomey and whether or not it's worthy of a second look or a new perspective. If you like these videos and want to help out in its continued production, you can do so on patreon.com. The link is in the description box below. Know thyself. Remember your ancestors. Peace.